The boy sat mute, staring at the vampire, and the vampire sat collected, his hands folded on the table, his narrow, red-rimmed eyes fixed on the turning tapes. His face was so gaunt now that the veins of his temples showed as if carved out of stone, and he sat so still that only his green eyes evinced life, and that life was a dull fascination with the turning of the tapes. Then the boy drew back and ran the fingers of his right hand loosely through his hair. "No," he said with a short intake of breath. Then he said it again louder. "No!" The vampire didn't appear to hear him. His eyes moved away from the tapes towards the window, towards the dark grey sky. It didn't have to end like that," said the boy, leaning forward. The vampire, who continued to look at the sky, uttered a short, dry laugh. "All the things you felt in Paris," said the boy, his voice increasing in volume. "The love of Claudia, the feeling, even the feeling for Lestat, it didn't have to end. Not in this, not in despair. Because that's what it is, isn't it? Despair." "Stop," said the vampire abruptly, lifting his right hand. His eyes shifted almost mechanically to the boy's face. "I tell you, and I have told you, that it could not have ended any other way." "I don't accept it," said the boy, and he folded his arms across his chest, shaking his head emphatically. I can't." And the emotion seemed to build in him, so that without meaning to, he scraped his chair back on the bare boards and rose to pace the floor. But then, when he turned and looked at the vampire's face again, the words he was about to speak died in his throat. The vampire was merely staring at him, and his face had that long, drawn expression of both outrage and bitter amusement. "Don't you see how you made it sound? It was an adventure like I'll never have in my whole life. You talk about passion, you talk about longing, you talk about things that millions of us won't come to ever taste or ever come to understand. And then you tell me it ends like that. I tell you," he stood over the vampire now, his hands outstretched before him, "if you were to give me that power, the power to see and feel and live forever." The vampire's eyes slowly began to widen, his lips parting. "What?" he demanded softly. "What?" "Give it to me," said the boy, his right hand tightening in a fist, the fist pounding his chest. "Make me a vampire now," he said as the vampire stared aghast. What happened then was swift and confused, but it ended abruptly with the vampire on his feet holding the boy by the shoulders, the boy's moist face contorted with fear, the vampire glaring at him in rage. "This is what you want," he whispered, his pale lips manifesting only the barest trace of movement. "This, after all I've told you, is that what you ask for?" A small cry escaped the boy's lips, and he began to tremble all over, the sweat breaking out on his forehead and on the skin above his upper lip. His hand reached gingerly for the vampire's arms. "You don't know what human life is like," he said this is the boy. "You don't know what human life is like," he said on the edge of breaking into tears. "You've forgotten. You don't even understand the meaning of your own story, what it means to be a human being like me." And then a choked sob interrupted his words, and his fingers clung to the vampire's arms. "God," the vampire uttered, and turning away from him, almost pushed the boy off balance against the wall. He stood with his back to the boy, staring at the grey window. "I beg you, give it all one more chance in me," said the boy. The vampire turned to him, his face as twisted with anger as before, and then gradually it began to become smooth. The lids came down slowly over his eyes, and his lips lengthened in a smile. He looked again at the boy. "I failed," he sighed, smiling still. I have completely failed. No, the boy protested. Don't say any more, said the vampire emphatically. But you have one chance left. Do you see the reels? They still turn. I have but one way to show you the meaning of what I've said. And then he reached out for the boy so fast that the boy found himself grasping for something, pushing against something that was not there, so his hand was outstretched still when the vampire's hand had pressed to his chest, the boy's neck bent beneath his lips. Do you see? Whispered the vampire, and the long silky lips drew up over his teeth, and two long fangs came down into the boy's flesh. The boy stuttered, a low guttural sound coming out of his throat, his hand struggling to close on something, his eyes widening only to become dull and grey as the vampire drank. And the vampire meantime looked as tranquil as someone in sleep. His narrow chest heaved so subtly with his sigh that it seemed to be rising slowly from the floor and then settling again with that same somnambulistic, I have no idea what that word means, grace. There was a whine coming from the boy, and when the vampire let him go, he held him out with both hands and looked at the damp white face, the limp hands, his eyes half closed. The boy was moaning, his lower lip loose and trembling as if in nausea. He moved again louder, and his head fell back and his eyes rolled up into his head. The vampire set him down gently in the chair. The boy was struggling to speak, and the tears which sprang now to his eyes seemed to come as much from that effort to speak as from anything else. His head fell forward, heavily, drunkenly, and his hand rested on the table. The vampire stood looking at him, and his white skin became a soft, luminous pink. It was as if a pink light were shining on him, and his entire being seemed to give back that light. The flesh of his lips was dark, almost rose in color, and the veins of his temples and his hands were mere traces on his skin, and his face was youthful and smooth. "Will I die?" the boy whispered as he looked up slowly, his mouth wet and slack. "Will I die?" he groaned, his lip trembling. "I don't know," the vampire said, and he smiled. The boy seemed on the verge of saying something more, but the hand that rested on the table slid forward on the boards, and his head lay down beside it as he lost consciousness. When next he opened his eyes, the boy saw the sun. It filled the dirty, undressed window and was hot on the side of his face and his hand. For a moment he lay there, his face against the table, and then, with a great effort, he straightened, took a long, deep breath, and, closing his eyes, pressed his hand to that place where the vampire had drawn blood. When his other hand accidentally touched a band of metal on the top of the tape recorder, he let out a sudden cry because the metal was hot. Then he rose, moving clumsily, almost falling, until he rested both his hands on the white wash basin. Quickly he turned on the tap, splashed his face with cold water, and wiped it with a soiled towel that hung there on a nail. He was breathing regularly now, and he stood still, looking into the mirror without any support. Then he looked at his watch. It was as if the watch shocked him, brought him more to life than the sun or the water, and he made a quick search of the room, of the hallway, and, finding nothing and no one, he settled again into the chair. Then, drawing a small white pad out of his pocket, and a pen, he set these on the table and touched the button of the recorder. The tape spun fast backwards until he shut it off. When he heard the vampire's voice, he leaned forward, listening very carefully, then hit the button again for another place, and, hearing that, still another. But then at last his face brightened, as the reels turned and the voice spoke in an even, modulated tone. It was a very warm evening, and I could tell as soon as I saw him on St. Charles that he had some place to go. And quickly the boy noted. Lestat, off St. Charles Avenue, old house crumbling, shabby neighborhood, look for rusted railings. And then, stuffing the notebook quickly in his pocket, he gathered the tapes into his briefcase, along with the small recorder, and hurried down the long hallway and down the stairs to the street, where in front of the corner bar his car was parked. And that is the end of Interview with the Vampire. Alright, that is the end of Interview with the Vampire. That's the whole book. We've gone through the text from beginning to end with analysis every day. Well, almost every day. I missed yesterday, but I'm back today to finish it off. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the little section we've just read and give some analysis on that. And then I'm going to wrap it up with some overarching analysis and closing thoughts on the entire text as a whole. There is so much to talk about with this book, so I'm going to be nowhere near as comprehensive as I could be, or as the book deserves. There's plenty of opportunities to talk about that in the future, I think. But these are just my overarching, off some notes, thoughts as we finish up Interview with the Vampire. So, let's get started. The notes on the section that we've read today, in which we see that the boy has just listened to the end of Louis's story, and in response to Louis's conclusion, this conclusion of this kind of moral emptiness, this conclusion of, his fate being inevitable, and this notion of no longer caring about morality and losing touch with his humanity being inevitable, the boy doesn't buy it whatsoever. And he calls out Louis's delusion for what it is, and that's despair. He remarks specifically that it doesn't have to end like this. And he's right, it doesn't have to end like this. As we've observed time and time again throughout this novel, Louis's conclusions on these moral issues, Louis's conclusions about the amount of agency he has over his own actions and his ability to make the right decision, it's nearly always founded in his desire to not make the right decision. Whenever Louis says, I can't do the right thing, what he really means is, I don't want to do the right thing. And so when Louis is talking to this boy and he's come to this conclusion, it seems only right that the boy says, what? No, you're full of shit. You can, you're lying. You don't have to end. It doesn't have to end like this. You don't have to come to these conclusions. But the justification the boy gives Louis as to why it doesn't have to end in this despair is not based off of Louis being able to be a good person, Louis being able to go past the bad things that have happened to him and, continue to be good into the future. It instead kind of presents this selfish desire for power. The boy immediately calls for being made into a vampire himself, as opposed to going, it doesn't matter that you're a vampire, you can still be a good person. He instead goes, I don't care, I want to be a vampire. I would use the power so much better than you. I would not fall into despair. I would be fine. And this throws Louis through a massive loop, because what was Louis's intention behind telling the boy this story? He remarks that he's failed. And I think that ultimately, what Louis wanted to do in telling his life story to someone was really just the typical Louis narcissism, in which he wants to let someone know how terrible his life was so that he could vindicate his own evil actions through having someone agree with him as to how terrible his life was and how much it makes so much sense that you no longer care about anything now. That makes perfect sense because you've had a terrible life and you're completely right, Louis, and you're so smart. You're smarter than everyone else, Louis. I think that's what Louis wanted. I think Louis just wanted to come in and have the boy agree with him that Louis's conclusions were completely right. And when the boy doesn't agree with him, and in fact the boy completely disagrees with him, Louis doesn't know what to do. He goes crazy. He doesn't quite go crazy, but he goes cruel. His response to this boy asking for this vampiric power off Louis is to drain him. And not just drain him, to drain him in quite a sadistic manner. When the boy asks him, "Will I die?" Louis just looks at him and goes, "I don't know," and then smiles. And he's smiling, he's taking pleasure in this cruelty, which I think is just indicative of the fact that Louis has become a worse person than he already was. He was already a pretty bad person, as I think I've observed throughout the text, but he's become quite evil and just morally abhorrent at this stage. And he's using this notion of not caring about anything as justification for his evil, and a way to pretend that he has no choice but to be entirely selfish. Because, to a degree, you can understand the appeal of his vampirism to an outside observer. There is an appeal to this fantasy of vampirism, this power, this immortality, this desirability that it presents. And there's nothing inherently evil about them either. There is some degree of evil to be found in the fact that you become a exploitative creature. It's not a good thing to become a vampire, most certainly. You should not desire it, because by becoming a vampire, you are forced into a state where you must live an exploitative existence. You must feed off of living things in order to survive. Draining animals being the least morally bad state of existence. But it's not desirable, really, in that regard. But there is still an appeal to it, I think. The appeal of this immortality, this power, as I've said. And it just seems that most of the people who get turned into vampires choose to be evil for one reason or the other. And when the boy justifies this in selfish terms, he doesn't seem to really care or address the killing people part. He instead talks about the beauty, the feeling. It's all about how good it would be to be a vampire, as opposed to any consequences that will be wrought upon those around them. I think also another bad thing about being a vampire is the fact that you would be taken out of the context of those around you, so you would lose the people you have lived your life alongside eventually, and therefore it would be kind of this manifest selfishness in which you retain life whilst they do not. But when you see this world where there's no real justification in the text for why vampires kill people beyond the fact that it feels good, it's the ultimate experience, I can't really conclude that the vampires are inherently evil. I can conclude that it's probably not a good thing to be made into a vampire, and that it's probably a bit insane to want to become one. But I can't say they're inherently evil. It seems as though it is possible to be a vampire and a good person if that vampirism has been thrust upon you as something unwilling, like it in reality was to Louis. There's kind of this pretense that Louis chose his vampirism, but he really didn't. It's this faux choice where Lestat drained him and then was like, "Do you really want to die?" Well, of course, someone on the verge of death is going to be really tempted not to die. It's not really a proper informed choice then at all. And this, it seems very, very difficult then to buy into what Louis is saying. I suppose is what I'm trying to get at here, is that there's nothing inherently evil about vampires, but at the same time we shouldn't want to be them. And when Louis leaves the room and leaves the boy goes to seek out Lestat, which shows this desperation that he has for the power that Louis has presented him with. And it seems to present this almost cynical view, I suppose. This cynical view that individuals will do whatever it takes to gain power over each other. And it also, I guess, ties into this existentialism and fear of death, because in being immortal, you can remove that fear. And so it's a selfish temptation. I think that's what vampirism is in this text. Vampirism is selfishness. To be a vampire and to live as the vampires of this text do, you become this manifest selfishness, a creature of utter narcissism, only interested in self-preservation. Not through any nature, not through anything that they would inherently be. There's no outside force forcing these vampires to be so selfish. But it's purely a result of the fact that it seems that it is the most selfish people who end up being sought out and turned into vampires. And that to inherently desire to be a vampire, you would have to have this core selfishness, as the boy seems to have when he goes to seek out Lestat. But that's sort of some very, very scattered. I'm sorry, I was all over the place there towards the end of that. But I think you get the core of what I'm saying. It's just this notion of vampires as selfish creatures, and the fact that that Louis wants to present this selfishness and this self-interest and these multiple lifetimes of narcissism and evil as something necessary. And when the boy doesn't buy that, and in fact responds with his own selfish desire for that same power, Louis doesn't know what to do. And he nearly kills the boy. He shows the face of his cruelty, and then he runs off into the night. And the boy is left then seeking out another avenue to fulfill his desire for power over others. And in that, it's quite a sad ending, I guess. Quite a almost cynical ending. And it presents this view of people as purely individualistic and purely desiring control and power and immortality, which I guess might not be too far from wrong. It's certainly a tempting prospect. But I guess this kind of brings me into my overarching observations on the text as a whole. Because what I really read this book as is I read this book as a story about bad people who use bad things happening to them as an excuse to be worse. The vampire, to me, is a manifestation of the worst aspects of hyper-individualism. They are greedy, they are selfish, they are cruel, they are detached from the suffering of others, purely interested in what can benefit them. And in Interview, this reading is supported time and time again. Nothing forces the vampires to be bad people. They choose it for their own personal gain. And it is not a good thing to be a vampire. You are forced to be a parasite, so it's a bad thing to want to become one. But it is possible to be a good vampire. There's no moral force making you be bad. And even though some of its aspects may be desired, you ultimately should reject them if you want to lead a moral existence from the outset. But if it's forced upon you, it is still possible to be moral with whatever tools you have available. And that lore of selfishness is highlighted in The Boy. Existentialism is also a major theme that runs throughout the novel. And you can feel this crisis of faith radiating off the pages time and time again. How can someone find motivation in a world without God or a purpose? And this text doesn't necessarily give us that answer explicitly. It hints towards it. Louis has that great rant at Armand where he says that human life is the most ultimate important thing and that the preservation of human life is valuable. And it hints towards this notion of us finding meaning in our common humanity and a desire to improve the situation of others. But it never explicitly says that, and it doesn't explicitly come to that conclusion. But what it does show us is that descending into nihilism is harmful. Any character that embraces nihilism uses that view as a justification for unbelievable harm unto others. Armand and Louis in particular, but Lestat also, because Lestat is his own form of willful nihilist. He's kind of a very happy nihilist who, when asked why does he do things, he says that he likes it. It's purely interested in personal pleasure and satisfaction is what allows them to justify the horrible things they do to people. And as long as we accept that harming other people is bad, and if you don't believe that harming other people is bad, then I don't really know what to say to you. I think you'll have already disagreed with most of what I've said during this reading, and to be honest, I just don't know how to convince you otherwise. I think the common humanity of people is incredibly important, and a desire to help and assist other people is massively critical to our shared sense of humanity. But as long as we accept that harming other people is bad, then we can conclude that this nihilistic vampirism that many of the characters adopt is wrong, and that there has to be some other way around it. And that, much like that boy talking to Louis concludes that it doesn't have to end like that, we can also say to these characters, it doesn't have to end like that. But instead of doing what the boy does and going, give me a shot at vampirism, let me have all these powers so I can use them for my personal gain, we can instead go, you can just try your best to be good. You can just not live exclusively for your own personal pleasure, and you will likely find a greater satisfaction in that. But regardless, the struggle and angst is still tangible within this text, because it is hard to find meaning and be a good person. It is not easy to abandon your selfishness. It is not easy to think about the wants and desires of other people and to try and be a good person. But what this text does illustrate to us is that it is very necessary for us to do that. Because the alternative is cruelty and meaninglessness and a descent into despair, as we see with Lestat, as we see with Armand, and as we see with Louis. So that's some notes about, first of all, this notion of vampirism as selfishness, and also this vampiric existentialism. And I think also there's a very clear parallel within this text, and one of the things I like to focus on a lot is the parallels between the individualism of the vampires in this text and a presentation of capitalistic forces, because vampires very, very traditionally would represent capitalistic influences, very, very popular in political literature referring to capitalistic forces. And you can see the metaphor fairly evidently in what they are. They drain blood, drain life, in the same way that you could drain labor, drain economic power. And in this text, I believe the vampires are pretty explicitly economic many, many times. I mean, Lestat's beginning motivation for seeking out Louis is his wealth, as we've observed. And the fact that all of the vampires in this text are of a certain social standing and a certain wealth and a certain economic power, I suppose, really supports this reading of them as this kind of economic metaphor for a kind of roving millionaire class that is granted through their economic power the complete freedom to do whatever they want while facing no consequences for their exploitation of those beneath them. And even when a person is, brought into that class from outside it, as we've seen with Claudia, they immediately begin to adopt the characteristics of that class and act in the same selfish, exploitative manner as the people who brought them up into it. A further consideration in regards to this is that the vampires in this text appear to be a very conservative force in many ways. They are transgressive against social norms in terms of their sexuality, but I think that's about it. In all other terms, they are very, very much the bastions of white European colonial power. I don't think there is a single non-white vampire in the text. And the vampires are predominantly male, and it is certainly the case that any vampire with any semblance of power over other vampires is male. So, you can almost consider these vampires to also be these immortal beacons of patriarchal and colonial authority, kind of haunting the world and preying upon people in this literal sense, in the same way that metaphorically these past conservative forces still prey upon our society today. I think that's another very, very relevant reading and a really important theme to this novel as a whole. And so I've mentioned some of the things that I think this novel does very, very well there. But I think it will be remiss not to mention some of the things that I think it does a little more poorly. And I think the first one is the fact that the way this text deals with race and racial issues is pretty poor overall. At best, it's quite clumsy, and at worst, it feels like pretty blatant exoticism. And I think that the real indicative thing here is the fact that Louis's attitudes towards race are never properly addressed. Louis was a slave owner, and he never gets called out on that. He never gets called out about the really racist ways he views the characters of other racial backgrounds that he meets throughout the text, either on his own plantation in New Orleans or when he's in Eastern Europe looking at the locals there. And I genuinely don't care that was of the time Louis is from, because Louis moves through time, and therefore he is a representation of the immortal power of that ideology. And I think it's not great that the text kind of waves away Louis's racist attitudes. Louis has this throwaway comment where he's like, of course I didn't know back then that they were smarter than that, when he's talking about his slaves. But the way he does it, he still never acknowledges it as wrong. He never is called out on that being wrong. His notion of shared humanity that he seems to hold so dear seems to extend only to other vampires at worst, and only other Western European white people at best. It's never addressed satisfactorily, I think. And I think it does hamper the text a little bit, and it makes, I don't understand how anyone could do a reading of Louis as a good person when considering that. And another thing I want to talk about here is the sexuality and relationships within the text, because I think at the core there is a progressive attitude towards sexuality and relationships at the core of this text. Louis and Lestat seem capable of showing sexual attraction to anyone, and Armand and all of the characters, really. And I can understand why someone would appreciate that representation in such a popular and prominent book. And I think that is valuable at a base level. However, I think that representation is kind of harmed by the fact that all of the relationships within the text are founded in abuse and control. And the sequels do a bit of a better job at this. And I understand that most of the people who are big fans of this series started on The Vampire Lestat. So I can get why a lot of fans of the Vampire Chronicles have very, very different views on this series to me. But I just can't get over how manipulative all the relationships are, not only in this book, but across the books of the series I've read. They just aren't cute to me. They aren't wholesome. And I think it ultimately, it doesn't remove the value of the representation that these characters get, but I think it definitely puts a bit of a damper on it, and it definitely makes the execution a bit poorer. And in particular, the relationship between Louis and Claudia, which I had forgotten how blatant it was, and it was genuinely like a bit difficult to read at times with how explicit it was, because Claudia is a child. I don't care how technically old she is a child, and it is not wholesome to read about her in sexual manners. And I can understand it with Claudia. I can see the connection between a vampire child and Anne Rice's own loss and the coping within that. But at the core, when we remove that and we read Louis and Claudia's relationship, it feels like this tale of immortal noncery as opposed to anything else. Louis's language of special vampire love that he brings up time and time again in explanation to his desire for Claudia is very reminiscent of the same kind of language literal pedophiles use to try and justify their attraction to children. You wouldn't understand. It's a special love. It's just between us. Only we understand it. And I really think that it's not good. And the thing that really gets me here about Louis and Claudia's relationship is that nobody ever calls Louis out on it. Nobody ever goes, like, Louis, what the fuck? What are you doing? And there was perfect opportunity for it in the theatre, because it appears that, people were frustrated with Claudia, and I suggested this notion of perhaps one of the reasons they, don't trust Louis is because they believe he made a child into a vampire. But it feels like the text just concludes that the reason they want to kill them is because of the fact that they killed Lestat and because they don't like him for another reason. But if they were to just explicitly add to that the fact that vampires, even vampires, are against this notion of immortal pedophilia, it would make the text a lot more reconcilable in that regard. But as it stands, I feel like it just presents it in far too legitimate a light. Because I don't think there can be any legitimacy to sexual attraction towards a child, no matter how mentally old that child may be. Especially when real-world pedophiles use that same kind of justification in, pornographic fantasies about children. The typical, she's actually a 3,000-year-old vampire argument. Quite literally in this regard, although she's only like 100 and something years old. And I also think it's not great that one of the most sort of gay icon vampires in Louis and Lestat also happen to be child molesters. I think that verges on the point of being an actively harmful depiction when you consider it in that light. And the fact that no tangible consequences are ever faced. I mean, Claudia gets killed and Louis ends up sad, but the reasoning behind that is never because of the deeply disturbing nature of of Louis' sexual desire for her, or not sexual vampire desire, but my opinion on that. When vampiric feeding is framed in its explicitly sexual terms as it is in this novel, I do not care that it tries to justify Louis' vampiric attraction towards Claudia as anything but sexual. It's very clearly sexual, or whatever equivalent of sexual Louis may experience. And because this is never really called out that much, I can't tell whether this relationship is being written completely seriously or not. I feel like it's being lended far too much legitimacy in its depiction, and I feel like the novel needs an instance of, Louis getting smacked the fuck down for being sexually attracted to a child. And it just doesn't occur. And it's something that annoys me a lot about this text. And it makes those sections really uncomfortable to read. And while I was reading them, I was thinking to myself, is this novel actually as good as I remember it being? Because these bits are really, really uncomfortable and bad to read. And the only thing that kind of redeems the relationship between Louis and Claudia to a degree is the interpretation of reading it, in which Claudia does not, feel for Louis at all, and that she instead is manipulating him in order to assure her own survival. And that turns Louis's character into an even more despicable individual that he already was. And it adds a new dimension to Claudia's character, but it still creates an uncomfortable depiction in the fact that Louis never faces proper consequences for his actions. There's also the fact that in the sequels, that reading kind of gets retconned and debunked, where there's the letter from Claudia where, she admits in her own private diary that she really, really loves Lestat and Louis, despite everything they've done to her. Which, I kind of discount the sequels in regards to reading Interview with the Vampire, because it's such a different book. And I feel like reading Claudia as actually loving them is actively harmful. But yeah, that's that out of the way. And those are some of the things I really don't like about the book. And the book certainly isn't perfect. But overall, there is no denying that this is certainly one of the most important vampire books ever written. And it is easily one of my favorites. When the prose in this book is at its best, it is heart-wrenchingly good. That existentialism, that search for meaning, that internal conflict of self-interest versus moral good, it is iconic. And despite those problems, it is still worth reading over and over again because of its strengths. And it is genuinely worth studying. And I think it is a damn shame that this book, does not as frequently get held up alongside the other literary giants of the genre as an academically relevant book, as often as it should be. I think that Interview with the Vampire deserves the same kind of academic attention that books like Dracula and Carmilla receive. I think it is that important and that influential. And that is it. That is the end of my reading and analysis of Interview with the Vampire. If you have made it this far through the series, I'm very appreciative and grateful for your viewing. This has been something to do every day during lockdown, and I understand the world has been going somewhat to shit in recent weeks, and this has been a nice little coping mechanism at times to keep me occupied and try and keep me doing something productive while the world burns down around me. And perhaps it needs burning. Perhaps, as Claudia suggests, fire does purify at the end of the day. And if things need burning down, we can always call on Louis, because I'm sure he can't wait to set another building on fire. He's just sitting there with matches in hand. The absolute mad lad. But yeah, I'm very grateful if you've watched this far, and I hope you have enjoyed my reading and very, very scattered thoughts on this book that is very, very important to me. I apologize that at times the analysis is a bit all over the place. I apologize if I have contradicted myself at any point. I am not going to pretend to be a genius analyst for this text. I am not going to pretend to know it inside out. All I am going to, say to you is that I really like this book, and I hope there is something of value you have found in my reading and thoughts on it every day for the past month and a bit. And with that, I will leave you. So for the last time in this series, that has been a section of Interview with the Vampire. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe I'll see you again for something else soon. Take care.